On Monday, 9th of August 2021, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced its latest report on the physical science basis for what we know about climate change. It was produced by 200 scientists. It was several thousand pages long. Of course, most people aren't going to read that or even the short summary for policymakers. Everything they know about the report is going to be filtered through the mainstream media and what political leaders said while they were launching the report, which is probably deeply unfortunate for their state of mind because those people went full on apocalyptic. This was seeded by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who called the report a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening, he said in a statement. This report must sound a death knell for the coal and fossil fuels before they destroy our planet. Doomsday UN report says global warming is already causing extreme weather and the world will heat up by 1.5 C by 2040, a decade earlier than forecast. Time is running out. Nobody is safe. World shudders at terrifying climate report. All of that will have attracted lots of clicks for the news sites, which makes their advertisers happy. And it pleased a lot of people who feel that strong messages will invoke fear that might push politicians to take more action than they otherwise would have done. But it has consequences. Psychologists have found rising levels of extreme anxiety, including amongst young people, as they get fed constant graphic visions of the very worst case scenarios over and over again. The alternative to that isn't to pretend that there's nothing to be concerned about, it's to take a sober look at the actual report and to take as much of a spin out of it as possible. So let's do that. The IPCC publication is the first part of a three-part report. This one focuses on the physical science behind what we know. The second will look at the expected impacts on the planet, where we're most vulnerable and how we can adapt. And the third will look at how we can reduce climate change, mitigation. Those latter two will be published in February and March next year, respectively. There are 4 key takeaways worth noting from the report based on what I've seen so far and what scientists are saying about it. Let's have a look at them. Number 1. Not much has changed. You can see why that message is somewhat at odds with all those headlines, but it's true. There were no new shocking revelations in this report that someone thought was going to be 10 times worse than we thought. Yes, it shows that each of the last 4 decades have been progressively the warmest since the 1850s, when we started measuring such things. And it shows clearly how the warming of those last 4 decades across the world compares with the warming and cooling trends from the previous 80 years. Now that's all stuff that we knew already. But what has changed, according to the IPCC, is this. We're increasingly confident in what we already thought was the case. So, for instance, that's led scientists to move from the position where it was considered highly likely that current warming is being driven by human emissions of greenhouse gases to the statement that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land. The growing certainty has come from increasing numbers of observations and measurements, evidence from historical clues, and understanding of underlying processes supporting what was already held to be shown by computer models. Whereas the previous report, AR5, was in some key areas wholly based on what computer models were showing, AR6 is much more supported by the multiple lines of evidence and hence the increase in confidence on a number of areas. And it shows in more detail how greenhouse gases are driving global warming. Concentrations of CO2, methane and nitrous oxide are thought to have increased at rates that have no precedent on centennial timescales in at least the past 800,000 years. So this chart shows the contribution that each of the different factors makes to warming or cooling the planet, with the pink, brown and turquoise lines showing the warming provided by CO2, methane and nitrous oxide. The grey line shows the things actually been pushing the other way. Aerosols, which are particles of air pollution that have a net cooling effect as they reflect sunlight away from the Earth. The planet would have warmed significantly more if those aerosols hadn't been a factor. Indeed, some of the genuine doomsayers were predicting that the pause in human activity during the pandemic lockdowns would mean that the aerosols would clear the air and the Earth would roast in a fiery Armageddon. That didn't happen. I'm not aware that any of those people recanted as a result. They just moved on to the next prediction. By the way, you may be curious about the dramatic downward spikes in the graph. Those are the short-lived impacts of volcanic eruptions that put large amounts of aerosols into the upper atmosphere, leading to a short-term cooling. This graph shows the difference between how the climate would be expected to be without those changes in greenhouse gases and how it is with them, based on multiple runs of the latest climate models, and it shows pretty graphically the difference between where we are and where we would have been. One of the other things that has enabled scientists to make more confident projections around future warming is that in this report they've narrowed the range for what's called equilibrium climate sensitivity, or ECS. That number is how much warming you would get from a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere. For decades, this had been stuck between a pretty wide range, with the 2013 report the latest to state that it was likely that it was between 1.5C and 4.5. That has now been narrowed to being likely to be between 2.5C and 4. That means that those who'd hoped that increased CO2 wouldn't add as much warming have been disappointed, but then also those who suggested it would be massively higher than thought have also been given reassurance. By the way, this is also the source of the false reports, such as that Mail headline claiming that the report says that 1.5 degrees C will be reached 10 years earlier than expected. What's in the latest report is in line with what was in the previous one, albeit it wasn't highlighted in that one, so not so much commented upon. So the AR6 says that we will likely pass 1.5 degrees C between 2027 and 2035, depending on emissions scenarios. It actually slightly increased the carbon budget that we have before we get to that point. Okay, on to takeaway number 2. This report brings in new scenarios for how the future is going to play out. There are 3 things that affect how much the planet warms. One is how sensitive the climate is to CO2, which we've just been talking about. And another is obviously how much CO2 we actually emit as a future, as a society. The authors of the IPCC report, of course, have no way of knowing what governments worldwide are going to do over the coming decades, so they have to take a number of possibilities and map out the consequences should that be the route that we take. The previous report used 4 scenarios, which it called Representative Concentration Pathways, RCPs. You'd have thought that climate scenarios would have done for a title, really. These range from RCP 2.6, the lowest emission scenario, through RCP 4.5, 6.0, and then the extreme end 8.5. RCP 8.5 was controversial because it was based on an unlikely scenario, where instead of taking any measures to mitigate climate change, instead we started burning fossil fuels twice as fast. Those scenarios have now been replaced by what are called Shared Socio-Economic Pathways, SSPs. Seriously, climate scenarios would be just fine. They are based on different visions of the future, depending on energy use, air pollution control, land use, and of course greenhouse gas emissions. And there's one additional one, so we now have a core set of 5 scenarios. SSP 1 to 1.9, the lowest emission scenario, sees a slight overshoot on the 1.5 degree target, but then brings back down through carbon capture measures. The next optimistic one is SSP 1 to 2.6. That one has us staying below 2 degrees C warming. SSP 2 to 4.5, that's in line with best delivery of the pledges made under the Paris Agreement on climate change. That arrives at 2.7 C by the end of the century. That's the closest one to the pathway we're currently on. Then the 2 more extreme scenarios, SSP 3 to 7.0, which imagines no additional climate policy with high non-CO2 emissions, and then SSP 4 to 8.5 with no additional climate policy and with emissions boosted by aggressive continuing use of fossil fuels. Which are the preferred, most likely scenarios? Well, the IPCC declares it cannot choose a favourite amongst its children. An aspect of the previous report that has been strongly criticised, and I found it hard to disagree with those arguments, is that the most extreme scenario, RCP 8.5, was overused by studies and consequently by the mainstream media, even though it's highly unlikely. And that's because you don't get the dramatic headlines from the middle of the road scenarios, you get them from the "this is what happens if we do nothing for the next 50 years but burn as much coal as possible" scenarios. Is there anything here to suggest that won't continue to be a problem with the new SSP 5 to 8.5 scenarios? The IPCC acknowledged the problem in its report. It arguably didn't do much to fix it, and given the hyperbole that accompanied the report's launch, I can't imagine much is going to change on that front. It's worth noting that some have defended the extreme scenarios, pointing out that even if society doesn't burn those fossil fuels, we could experience unlikely but possible carbon cycle feedbacks that would push us into that trajectory anyway, and therefore we need to do the studies in order to work out what would be the consequences of that happening. Carbon cycle feedbacks, I hear you say? Yep, well that brings us on to the next takeaway. Tipping points. I did a video on tipping points a year ago. These are thresholds that you cross. Often you don't know exactly where they are before you've crossed them, and they result in a no turning back system change, usually involving a mechanism that makes warming worse, like lots of methane coming out of the permafrost, for instance. When I said earlier that there are 3 things that affect how much the planet warms, this is the third one. There's a number that they've suggested, and they're much exploited by the doomster environmentalists as their explanation as to why short-term catastrophe is bearing down on us. When I did the research for my tipping points video, the evidence I found was relatively reassuring. Mainstream scientists and studies were increasingly discounting the earliest alarms as on further study being held to be pretty unlikely. Unlikely, of course, doesn't mean zero. It's a big world. Unlikely things happen all the time. Sometime after I did that video, I did hear rumblings from some of the scientist advocates on tipping points, outliers but respected scientists, hinting that the next IPCC report would be when the story on this topic was going to be put into the spotlight. Well, on the strength of this report, it was the dog that didn't bark. The IPCC says that such feedbacks can't be ruled out. Large uncertainties remain, but with more warming comes more risk. Doomsters are not happy. Ben C. on Twitter, for instance, insisted that feedbacks were being downplayed and they were essential to the degrowth agenda that he promotes. And he demanded if scientists could say whether or not feedbacks had yet kicked into high gear. Yes or no? Climate scientist Zeke Housefather replied that observed CO2 and methane concentrations in the atmosphere were fully explained by our emissions to date, so no evidence for hidden sources with sudden surges. That was not held to be a satisfactory answer. So nobody writes headlines about things that don't appear in the report, well, not unless they really know what they're talking about, but it is a significant part of this report nonetheless. The doomsters also didn't like discovering that the consensus that has formed over the last decade is that once society reaches net zero carbon, then the warming will stop. They have a mythology based on vast amounts of extra warming already being committed. For some reason, the activists who demand that the BBC tell the truth about the science didn't mean that truth, only their special truth. It won't stop extreme campaigners making whatever claims they want to make, but for those who are looking to what the scientific narrative actually is, it's at least one note of reassurance from a report that has plenty of serious implications. And then the fourth takeaway, and that comes to extreme weather and the attribution of such events to the impact of human-caused climate change. The projections are that more warming will bring increases in a number of different weather events. Extreme weather events are one of the areas that people fight about a lot. Every time there is an extreme flash flooding of the sort that we saw in Germany and in China, drought and forest fires like we've seen in southern Europe and the northwest of America, people will instantly jump on those as evidence of climate change. And that's going to happen every single time, of course. But we know that such events have happened throughout history, so the question isn't, was this event bad? The question is whether things are getting worse. People cherry pick measures that support their favoured position. So, for instance, the financial or the human life costs of an event. But those are not measures of how severe an event was, just how exposed human populations were. The IPCC report goes through a long list of extreme weather phenomena and reports on whether they've changed. And there are 4 areas where the data shows increases, and a bunch of others where, so far, it doesn't. Heat waves have become more frequent, pretty much across the world, as you can see from this map. No areas with decreases. And 2 specific types of drought, agricultural and ecological drought, increases seen in some parts of the world, only one part of the world with a decrease. Heavy rainfall has also become more common in many regions, no decreases, which is not to be automatically taken as suggesting that flooding has become more frequent, something that the report itself makes clear. And the data for some regions is less solid, so only low confidence for conclusions to do with Africa and South America. The IPCC is so clear about the overall evidence on these, it states that it's an established fact that human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases have led to an increased frequency and or intensity of some weather and climate extremes. Describing something as an established fact is highly unusual, reserved only for statements that are seen as being supported by overwhelming evidence. Now, floods, hurricanes, cyclones, tornadoes, strong winds, meteorological and hydrological droughts, those are not currently seen as more frequent or more intense. Now, that's all interesting, in the way that something we already knew can be interesting when restated with a larger weight of evidence. But the really interesting part on this side comes from the question of attribution. How individual extreme events come to be labelled as having been made more likely or more intense by human-caused climate change. The report reflects the growth over the last year or two of techniques for attribution science that suggest scientists are increasingly confident that they can talk about individual events. In the past, the formula has always been the cautious one, that it's not possible to determine whether this very specific event, blah, 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 blah. But for instance, with the recent heat dome, intense heat wave in Northwest America, and the heavy rains in Germany and Belgium, scientists quite quickly jumped in with studies that showed a connection to climate change. It seems highly feasible that they were right. But that said, I would expect this attribution process to get some significant kickback. And that's because, by all accounts, a bunch of people are planning to weaponize it. The growing hunger among activists for a crusade of blame is highlighted by that Guardian article with the "Guilty as Hell" headline. For those governments and businesses that still choose inaction, the IPCC report may well end up being used as key evidence against them in real courtrooms. We'll be taking this report with us to the courts, says Kaiser Kosonen at Greenpeace. By strengthening the scientific evidence between human emissions and extreme weather, the IPCC has provided new, powerful means to hold the fossil fuel industry and governments directly responsible for the climate emergency, she says. As far as these activists are concerned, you can now point to any policy that doesn't meet their purity criteria and suggest that the costs of extreme weather events can be held as the damages for that policy. You'd have to imagine that what value you get from clearer attribution from the science would be quickly undermined by such an approach, which, if allowed by the courts, would forcibly impose a single variable focus onto a wide range of public policy. It's not as though this is some bug in the attribution process being exploited in ways that had never been considered. Actually, this may well not be a bug, but a feature. Take this article on Politico, the climatologist who put climate science on the offensive. A vanishingly small number of scientists have the skills and know-how to respond in detail and quickly enough for journalists on deadline. One of them is German climatologist Friederike Otto. Along with her colleagues at the World Weather Attribution Service, she is using what's called attribution science to help answer the question of whether climate change made a heatwave, hurricane or drought more likely. It goes on to describe the role that she and her team took recently. North America was still trapped in the heatwave when Otto and her team declared on July 7 that the extremes of temperatures reaching almost 50 degrees Celsius or 122 degrees Fahrenheit would have been virtually impossible without the extra greenhouse gases humans have loaded into the atmosphere. No scientist would have been secure in making such a rapid and decisive statement until a few years ago. On Monday, the approach was prominently enshrined in the Bible of climate science, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment report. Okay, that's interesting, but there's a kicker. In her book, Angry Weather, Heat Waves, Floods, Storms and the New Science of Climate Change, published last year, Otto said it had always been her intention to put climate science on the offensive. Otto also works closely with lawyers using WWA research to develop lawsuits aimed at forcing companies or governments to lower their impact on the environment or even seek compensation for victims. One only needs to look at our recent court victory against Shell to realise how powerful IPCC science can be. Because she openly tailors her research towards political ends, Otto has been criticised as an advocate, but she says it's nonsense to knock scientists for considering how their work can be used. Nothing will inhibit the IPCC's credibility as a neutral body more swiftly, it seems to me, than a process it endorses and mainstreams being specifically designed to attack policymakers and companies. Knocking scientists for considering how their work can be used, say to create well-considered policy, yeah, that would definitely be a bad thing. But questioning the use of science to find new ways to blame people, individual decision makers, and impose the mindset of environmental extremists onto them, because, that's where this leads, that is a huge mistake. The dynamic it creates permits no trade-offs, no judgment, just a one-variable logic which will appeal to the activists with the most inflexible interpretation because it's almost custom designed for them. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's another mostly unremarked feature of this latest report that's going to become significant in the future. So look, what I'm not going to do is go through chapter by chapter about what we know about temperature increases, what we know about sea and land ice melt and sea level rise and all the rest of it. All of those sections are now updated, detailed. They are resources for those who'd like to know what the best evidence now says over the coming years. They confirm what we already knew, that climate change is serious, that it's underway, and that we need to take early, pragmatic and ambitious action to tackle it. The good news from the report is that amongst the other things that scientists are more confident about is that if we take action, it will solve the problem. Once we reach net zero emissions, the planet stops warming. And that if we do so as fast as practically possible, but no faster, that it will be in time to avoid the point where consequences become more difficult. Now, YouTube commenters who think they've spotted something that the authors of those 40,000 studies didn't, no doubt they will remain of the same view that they've always had, as will many of the politicians who have crafted their political identity around skepticism in this area. Does any of it justify the words of the UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres when he said, "Today's IPCC Working Group 1 report is a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk." Billions of people at immediate risk? No, that is Roger Hallam level hyperbole. The serious work that is the full scientific report deserves a grown-up, rational narrative. It doesn't seem we're likely to get that this side of the COP26 conference, in the run-up to which I think we're going to get a lot more heat and just not much more light. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.